Greetings, everyone. I am the Reverend Jill Olds, the director of the Yale Youth Ministry Institute at Yale Divinity School. The YMI is very pleased to welcome all of you to today's webinar entitled Talking About Race with Young People. We have an embarrassment of riches today because we're welcoming not one, not two, but three different presenters, Jennifer Guerra-Aldana, Erin Martinez, and Kat Armas. Together, these three women co-wrote Talking About Race with Teenagers, a youth leader's guide for exploring race, culture, immigration, and power. A very timely and insightful resource we'll be hearing more about in just a moment. This is our sixth gathering for this year's lecture series, which we have coined Thriving, Not Surviving, Building a Toolkit for a Flourishing Youth Ministry in 2021 to 2022. We've been exploring together this year what it looks like to not just survive during this liminal in-between season, but to actually thrive, both as youth leaders and as beloved children of God. Welcome back to those of you who have joined us before, and a special welcome to all of you who are joining our community for the first time. We're very glad to have you with us today. For those from a Christian tradition, we hope that as you digest the pancakes, the start of Lent promises a time of introspection and reflection for you all. We also invite you to mark your calendars for our two remaining events for this school year. On April 6th, we will invite the Reverend Dr. Montague Williams, and we'll explore how to empower young people towards a more beloved, racially just community. A link to that event can be found in your chat window, and it will be a virtual event, but we're delighted to share that we will be returning to in-person in May. So please save the date for Saturday, May 7th. At that time, we'll be hosting the Reverend Dr. Kenda Creasy Dean from Princeton Theological Seminary and the Reverend Matt Overton. Kenda and Matt will explore church innovation and specifically innovation in youth ministry in a day-long seminar. Kenda's reputation always precedes her, and some of you may remember Matt from when he spoke with us last year about his work in seeing youth ministry as a social enterprise opportunity by creating youth ministry nonprofits from his local church. Again, that event will be on Saturday, May 7th. Registration for that event will be $25 per person. The location is likely Yale Divinity School, but we'll keep you posted on that as we firm up that detail. You can find, again, a registration link and schedule for the day's event in your chat window as well. Our office has a great staff. I'd like to introduce them to you quickly and thank them for their work. The YMI falls under the purview of the Center for Continuing Education at YDS. So we have Kelly Morrissey, the managing director for the center, and we're blessed to have Megan Lukens, our communications coordinator. Thank you both for all that you do and for who you are. If you are new to the YMI, we invite you to peruse our website when you get a free chance. That's YaleYouthMinistryInstitute.org. We have a ton of resources on there, curricula for your youth, training modules for youth leaders, discussion forums, over 1,000 video clips and lectures given by the world's leading youth ministry experts and gurus. We have COVID-era resources. We have tips for resilience with youth, resources for anti-racism work, links to other articles and materials, and all of that is available for free. So please do feel free to check out our website. And now it is my deep pleasure to introduce you all to our speakers today, to Jennifer Guerra-Aldana, Erin Martinez, just got married last week, congratulations, and Kat Armas. Jennifer Guerra-Aldana is originally from Guatemala and grew up in Southern California as the daughter of church planters. She received her BA in social work from Point Loma Nazarene University, her MDiv from Fuller Theological Seminary, and has previously served as a youth pastor and social worker in San Diego County in California. She currently serves both as the coordinator of multicultural initiatives at Fuller Youth Institute and as a pastor of La Fuente Ministries, a bilingual intercultural ministry of Pasadena First Church of the Nazarene. Erin Martinez is a Pasadena, California native and holds a BA in International Relations with a minor in Spanish and Latin American Studies from Spelman College. She also has a culinary arts degree from LA Trade Tech College and an MA in Intercultural Studies with an emphasis in children at risk from Fuller Theological Seminary. She is currently the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Coordinator at Fuller Youth Institute, where she is committed to diversity and making sure that inclusion and equity are tracked across race, gender, and socioeconomic status. Kat Armas is a Cuban-American writer and podcaster from Miami, Florida, who holds a dual MDiv and MAT from Fuller Theological Seminary. Her first book, Abuelita Faith, What Women on the Margins Teach Us About Wisdom, Persistence, and Strength, sits at the intersection of women, scripture, and Cuban identity. Kat also explores these topics on her podcast, The Protagonistas, which centers the voices of Black, Indigenous, and other women of color in church leadership and theology. Kat is also the mother to a newborn babe, and so with deep gratitude for her contributions and out of a desire to honor her time on parental leave, Kat's portion of our session will be pre-recorded. And so to Kat from a distance and to Jen and Aaron here in our midst, welcome. We are beyond honored to have you, and I'll invite you to take it from here.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jill and everyone. We're so excited to be here with you today and just to have this important conversation and to have some good conversation. So with that, let me share my screen here. Okay. And I just want to make sure that everyone can see that. Okay, is that good? Everyone can see it.
Okay. You just stopped screen sharing, Aaron.
I did stop.
But we could see it. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Perfect. Okay, so before I begin our presentation today, I want to start out by recognizing and paying homage to the Quinnipiac, Paujusett, and the Wapinger Native tribes whose land Yale University stands on today, and the Keach and Tonga tribes whose land my home in Los Angeles, California stands on as well. The Quinnipiacs were living on the land now currently known as New Haven, Connecticut for centuries before the Europeans arrived, and their land covered roughly 300 square miles. When 500 settlers, eventually known as the New Haven Puritans, arrived in 1638 with Theophilus Eaton and John Davenport, the Quinnipiacs taught them how to farm, hunt, trap animals, and fish so they could survive as a colony. It is after this that the Puritans began to force their rigid form of Christianity on the tribe, and things went downhill for the Quinnipiacs. The Paujusetts were a native tribe whose land was made up of Orange, Woodbridge, and New Haven County through Fairfield County to Greenwich, and extending north into eastern Litchfield County up to the Massachusetts border. They were a proud people who became known as the Golden Hill Indians after their land was taken in 1659 by Europeans. In return for the thousands of square miles the Europeans took, they gave the Paujusetts an 80-acre tract of land known as Golden Hill, which became a tiny reservation that eventually settlers in Fairfield and Stratton began to encroach upon. The Wapingers and related Native American communities lived along the eastern banks of the Hudson River from modern Dutchess County, New York, east into central Connecticut, and south into Westchester County. They were a resourceful and creative tribe that emphasized hard work and sharing in jobs between men and women. In 1666, the Wapingers were quickly forced out of their land by Dutch colonists. The Keach Tribe developed indigenous ways to live sustainably on the land of Southern California and its natural resources. They lived in dome-like dwellings, mostly along the rivers of Southern California, which is where they got their name. They were one of two tribes in California that mastered boat building and traveled along the coast of Southern California. In the 1700s, Spain began to colonize California, and this brought about the painful end to the Keach tribe. The Tonga people inhabited what is now known as the Greater Los Angeles Basin but before then was known as the Tovan Gar. Their natural ancestral boundaries are the Santa Susana Mountains to the north, Elisa Creek to the south, the San Bernardino Mountains to the east, and the Pacific Ocean to the west, including the 4 Channel Islands of Santa Catalina, San Clemente, Santa Barbara, and San Nicolas. The Tongva were living on this land since before the 1500s, and in 1771, the Spanish set out to conquer and enslave the Tongva in order to use them as the labor force to build the Mission de San Gabriel Archangel. I learned the important practice of honoring the soul and land of Native peoples before presentations and the like from Native activist, speaker, and author Mark Charles. I highly recommend reading the book he co-authored with Dr. Seung-Chun Rah, entitled Unsettling Truths, The Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. As a descendant of both African American and Native ancestors, it is important to me to honor my ancestors, the ones that were already here when colonizers discovered it, and the ancestors, the ones who were stolen from their homeland and forced to build this land for free. And to acknowledge that wherever we go in the US, we're standing on stolen land. I encourage you to research the land your homes, churches, schools, parks, and favorite restaurants stand on. This is important as we begin to talk about race, power, immigration, and culture within the church, our communities, and with our young people, because our stories and genesis matters. Knowing where we come from and how we got here matters. So let's start out by talking about demographic trends in the US. Our main sources for our research are from Pew Research and the Census Report. So the changing face of America. By 2055, the US will not have a single racial or ethnic majority. Much of this change has been and will be driven by immigration. Nearly 59 million immigrants have arrived in the US in the past 50 years, mostly from Latin America and Asia. Over the next 5 decades, the majority of US population growth is projected to be linked to new Asian and Hispanic immigration. More Americans say immigrants strengthen the country than they say burden it. And most say the US's increasing ethnic diversity makes it a better place to live. So in a reversal of one of the largest mass migrations in modern history, net migration flows from Mexico to the US turned negative between 2009 and 2014, as more Mexicans went home than arrived in the US. And after rising steadily since 1990, the unauthorized immigrant population has leveled off in recent years, falling to 11.3 million in 2014 from a high of 12.2 million in 2007. Meanwhile, Asians are now the only major racial or ethnic group whose numbers are rising mainly because of immigration. And while African Americans make up a small share of the US immigrant population, their numbers are also growing steadily, roughly doubling every decade since 1970. So in 2021, last year, half of kids under 18 are non-white, while about 2/3 of all census counted US Americans are white today. When you look at those under the age of 18, that percentage drops to 1/2. And in 2065, the US will have no single racial or ethnic majority. So reflecting on your conversations about race, ethnicity, or immigration with young people, what stands out to you about your conversations? What's different when you talk with young people? And I encourage you all to reflect on these questions throughout our presentation and write some notes down as you answer them or as things come to you as we speak. If any questions come up for you, please write them down and save them until the end of our presentation for our Q&A portion. So listening to young people is so important, and young people have the imagination and vision to lead us. So what we need to do is ask better questions. At Fuller Youth Institute, we believe that the realities of young people are important to God and they're important for human flourishing. Therefore, they must be important to the church. So our words matter and our language matters. And as my colleague Jennifer says, when it comes to having conversation about race and ethnicity, our language becomes that much more important. So in these next few slides, I'm going to define some important terms that are really important for you to know within your discussions with race, for your discussions about race with young people. So first one being race. Race is a social creation that gives or takes power based on skin color and cultural background. Race is a social construct created based on the superiority of whiteness to all non-white people. So systemic or institutional racism. This is racism that is displayed within our political, religious, educational, and economic institutions and systems. We respond to systemic racism in different ways. Some of us have more power than others. Systemic racism is not just perpetuated by white people, although they have the most systemic power, but BIPOC, which is another word that I'm going to discuss, Black, Indigenous, people of color, can also play a part in institutionalized racism. We tend to enact these inherent racist realities with either passive or active racism. Active racism is racist behavior in which one is engaged with and supported by the ideology of white supremacy through speech, thoughts, and actions. In Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum's book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? She so eloquently describes racism by using a metaphor of a moving walkway at an airport. Active racism or racist behavior is the equivalent of walking fast on the walkway. She says the person engaged in active racism behavior has identified with the ideology of white supremacy and is moving with the moving walkway. White supremacy, the term that I used in here, asserts the domination of whiteness throughout society and culture. Passive racism is racist behavior in which no overt effort is being made to actively stop racism from happening or participate in it, which is neutral or complicit participation. So Dr. Tatum also describes passive racism as no overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt moves the bystanders along to the same destination as those who are actively walking. Some bystanders may see active racism taking place in front of them and choose not to participate, turn around, and walk the other way. But unless these bystanders begin walking actively in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, unless they're actively anti-racist, in other words, they will find themselves being carried along with the others. And an anti-racist is a person who is actively doing the work of fighting against racism through their words, actions, and thought processes. Internalized oppression. This is the prejudice beliefs we tell ourselves about our own race, culture, religion, gender orientation, and/or socioeconomic group that keeps us from being our own fully authentic selves. In the race guide, I discussed cultural misorientation, which is a concept coined by Dr. Dorith Jameson and Dr. Kobe Cambone, which is a specific type of internalized oppression that occurs within Black people that glorifies European culture, which Black people develop through media, society, and family dynamics. And an example that I use when I talk about this term, this experience, is Black children and the doll test that is a study that's been done so often and is very popular about Black children looking at the white doll versus the Black doll, which one's more beautiful, which one, it's the white doll with the blonde hair and the blue eyes, and the Black doll, which one is more beautiful, which one is safer, all those things. And so many children from young ages choose the white doll. These things have already been ingrained to them from little kids. So that's an example I use to describe this misorientation. Colorism is a form of racism that determines one person is superior to another based on the proximity to whiteness of their skin color and physical attributes, i.e. being tall, slender, blue eyes, blonde hair, thin lips, narrow nose. I'll explain more about colorism and what it looks like and sounds like after my final definition slide, which is BIPOC, which refers to any person who is non-white. The literal definition is Black, Indigenous, or people of color. So I want to tell you guys a little bit about myself and my story. I am of African American heritage, and this picture, this big picture in the center, is a collage I made in the 6th grade for a heritage project that is literally like my most prized possession. So it's truly Black girl magic, Black family magic. It just shows the beauty of Black people of all shades, my family on both sides, my native roots of being both Cherokee and Blackfoot, native tribes, HBCU legacy and importance. And if you don't know what an HBCU is, that's historically Black college and university, Black hair, beauty, gospel music, Black leaders, all of the things. And education has always been the highest goal in my family. We have an HBCU legacy in my family. My grandparents went to Prairie View A&M University in Corpus Christi, Texas. My mom went to Fisk in Tennessee. My brother went to Morehouse in Atlanta, and I went to Spelman in Atlanta, Georgia as well. And my dad went to UCSB, which is not an HBCU, but still a great school. So we still love him. But I said I wanted to share a bit more about colorism with you all in my next slide. And so I want to, and this is my family on the right. This is me graduating from Fuller as well on the bottom right. So with that, these are my parents. And this is my great-great-grandfather on the right. And so people have always asked me, both of my parents are Black, but they've always asked me, is your dad white? They always think he's like Jewish or Italian, but he is Black. And my dad is actually Creole, though. And Creole is used to describe descendants of French or Spanish colonists with a mixed racial heritage. So that's French or Spanish mixed with African American or Native American. And in my case, it's French, Native American, and Black. So my dad grew up in Augusta, Georgia, and in the deep, deep South. And he just tells us, he's told me so many horrific stories of him growing up not being Black enough or white enough for either side. And just the trauma that has been associated with him in his experience growing up in the South in the 50s and 60s. And I've experienced that in my life as well, being told, you know, I'm not Black enough, I sound white, you're not like most Black women, you're not like loud and ghetto. And as a light-skinned Black woman, I've also been asked, like, you can't just be Black, like, what do you mix with, you know? And don't get me started on the hair, right? Good and bad, and identity and what society does to communities of color with that. There's so many layers to the conversation. So the lived reality of African Americans is that we live with what W.E.B. Du Bois calls a double consciousness. And although we know our roots are African, we are also American, and we are constantly reminded that we are stolen people who reside in the land that we are forced to build for free. So we lived and still live with the tension of the societal and self-regulation of our bodies and actions in order to be considered acceptable as fully human in society, while also trying to live fully and authentically. The space we live in is part American dream, part African American reality. We feel this in our bodies and in our everyday experiences. And this is also what our youth are going through, even if they don't name all of this for you. I didn't have the language for what I was experiencing when I was a young person, but I have it now, and giving this language to them and talking with them about it is a huge gift. So that is so important for us. So thank you. That is my portion. I'm going to hand it off to Jen and Kat.
Thanks so much, Erin, for setting us up for this conversation. One of the things that we deeply cared about as we were writing this resource is that we talked about race in a way that also pushed the conversation about race. Oftentimes, because of the racialized history in the United States, we think within the binary of Black and white. But there's many of us that are quite smack in the middle, myself being Latina and Kat also reflecting that way. And we also recognize that there is a missing demographic in our authorship of an Asian American voice. While there was many involved in the process, with us. And so this is why we talk about, in a toolkit about race, we included a section on immigration. And that is because migratory patterns absolutely have everything to do with race and how the treatment of different racial groups affect the way that we either welcome or exclude the one that is on movement. And so again, I am so excited that you still get to hear from Kat today. And so we're going to step into the conversation of how do we layer the conversation of immigration on an already historical racialized society like the one we have here in the United States.
Hello, everybody. I am so happy to be here. Thank you so much. And I am thrilled not only that I get to chat with you today, but that you get to hear from my brilliant and amazing colleagues, Erin and Jen. So today I'm actually going to talk to you about immigration. We heard the census data, and so we are going to move from numbers to talking about lived realities and talking about something that is close to my heart as my family immigrated here in the 1960s. And I'll talk a little bit more about my story as I interweave it into everything else that I'm going to share today. But first, I'm going to share my screen so that you can see along or watch along with me. Give me 1 second. I am not great at all. Oh, here we go. I found it. Okay, so as I mentioned, I will be talking about immigration. And I think it's important to talk about immigration. And I'll explain sort of theologically why that is, particularly when we're talking about race, right? The two don't always go together. But I think that it is crucial to layer in migration when talking about race. And so as you may have heard, or as I mentioned, my name is Kat Armas. I am a second generation Cuban American born and raised in the city of Miami, which if you know anything about Miami, it is 100% a Cuban haven. In fact, it is called the sort of Latin American capital of the US in many spaces. So this means that I was exposed to multi-ethnic realities, from birth. All of my teachers and all of everyone in my community was, if not Cuban, was certainly Latina, Latino, Latine, right? In some way, shape, or form. So I was part of the quote unquote majority culture growing up. And it wasn't until I left my little Cuban haven of Miami that I realized that my culture and experiences were among the minority. Yes, it was a surprise when I first moved out of Miami to attend seminary in just the subculture of the subculture of white evangelicalism. It was very jarring for me because I was so, used to being part of the dominant culture. And so I was forced to wrestle with my ethnic identity. And what that meant, right, as I pursued formal theological education, and what that meant as I wanted to just live and exist and be in the world. At that moment, it was a very white evangelical world, and it since has changed. But yeah, realizing that my culture wasn't the dominant culture in many evangelical and mainline church spaces. I learned rather quickly that true diversity must be intentionally sought after and fought for, right? I also learned that putting in the hard work of living multi-ethnic and multicultural realities is central not only to God's kingdom vision, but to who God is. To this end, I love to say that the quote unquote image of God is not only an individual reality, but a collective one. No one person or one group of people can fully bear all that is God's image. Instead, each culture, people, and group offer a glimpse of a different aspect of the full image of God. So I want to start by talking a little bit about a person-centered multicultural community before sharing about migration and immigration specifically. So I'll move here. In Isaiah chapter 2, we find a prophetic vision concerning the quote unquote days to come, in which all the nations come to the mountain of God to worship. See, what's beautiful about this vision is that the nations don't join together as one ethnicity, but as their own separate people groups, representing different countries and races, worshiping God equally in their own language and with their own cultural backgrounds. And what I love is that in the book of Acts, after Pentecost, we start to see the fulfillment of this as Jews and Gentiles begin to form a blended family in Christ, which comes to a climax in Acts chapter 15. Later, Paul makes it clear in his letter to the Romans and in Galatians that Gentiles do not need to become like Jews or become Jews, nor do Jews need to renounce their Jewishness. Instead, Paul affirms both groups of people in the distinct ways that they worship Jesus. The early church was to be a bicultural body, right? The foundational principles being mutual submission, respect, and sensitivity toward each other's practices without imposing unnecessary burdens. Ultimately, the people of God and their distinctions were to do everything out of love. But it doesn't end there. And this is the verse that I have here in Revelation. You know, the theme of the divine image in a diverse collective resounds as God's desire for a perfected world. And it culminates in John of Patmos's vision of the new earth as one that possesses, quote, every nation from all tribes and peoples and languages standing before the throne and before the Lamb. This great multitude of people is not a homogeneous one, but one that represents a blended family made up of all races, ethnicities, and nationalities. As we can tell from Revelation 7, God is not, quote unquote, colorblind, right? Therefore, if we want to live into God's kingdom on earth, we must seek to emulate what I like to call revelation reality that invites each person with their own unique cultural background to feel represented and seen, that who they are is elevated and celebrated in the midst of the whole. So this is the reality that we are seeking to live into, right? On quote unquote, on earth as it is in heaven. Now, this reality is often true here in the US, thanks to the notion of migration or immigration, something that my own family is familiar with. So I'll share a little bit more about myself here, and then I'll share some words that we need to know when it comes to this topic. So my family immigrated to this country in the 1960s due to political unrest on their island of Cuba. So this notion of movement was at the forefront of my grandmother or my abuela's mind when we talked about our faith growing up. She often told stories of God's people and movement, right? The story of Israel headed out of Egypt to the promised land, or Mary and Joseph's journey to Bethlehem. Those were her favorite stories because they were the stories she resonated with the most. The stories of movement and migration shaped our cultural memories and theological imaginations. But more than anything, they reminded us that God's people have always been on the move, both in the Bible and in present day. Living in the United States means that we will continuously cross paths with those who are intimately acquainted with movement. It's the backbone of our country and what makes it so unique and vibrant and diverse. Migration is what gives flavor to our nation. It gives us new melodies and beats to dance to. However, the songs of our migrant neighbors are often silenced, particularly by those in power. Many who arrive to this country because of desperate circumstances are dehumanized, stripped of their dignity, and referred to as quote unquote illegal, whether their actual status in the legal immigration system is documented, undocumented, or somewhere in between. The notion of immigration is not only deeply personal, but also something I must consistently wrestle with both in action and reflection as a Christian living in the United States. Understanding both the history and the reasons for migration from biblical times to the present day helps us develop a holistic immigration ethic that will inevitably inform how we pray, how we vote, and how we engage this conversation with others, including and especially the young people in our lives. Ultimately, it will inform how we treat the quote unquote foreigner in our midst. So like I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about scripture and about migration and immigration, but before I do, I'd like to define some terms that you probably already know, but I just want to name them because words matter and language matters, and I want us all to be on the same page. So, migration, the movement of people from one place to another with the intentions of settling permanently or temporarily at a new geographic region. Movements are often over long distances and can be from one country to another or within a country or region itself. People may migrate as individuals, in family units, or in large groups. Migration can be voluntary, out of necessity, or forced. Immigration, the international movement of people to a country of which they are not natives or where they do not possess citizenship in order to settle as permanent residents. Refugee, a displaced person who is forced to leave their country due to war, natural disaster, or fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. Exile, the state of being barred from one's native country, typically for political or punitive reasons. We also have here Hispanic, people who share Spanish as a common language, a term adopted by the US government in the 1970s to give people from Latin America a common identity. So the word Hispanic is, US American constructed. Latino, A or E, any person of Latin American descent residing in the US. Latinos, Latines can have many colors, languages, and cultural backgrounds. This is not to be confused with Latin Americans, which refer to the people actually living in Latin America right now. So we have Afro-Latinos or Latinas or Latines, Latin Americans with African ancestry. The term may also refer to historical or cultural elements in Latin America thought to have originated within this community. In the US, Latinos with Caribbean roots are more likely to identify as Afro-Latino or Afro-Caribbean than those with roots elsewhere in Latin America. And then we also added here Asian American, although I don't speak particularly to Asian American or AAPI, but we wanted to include that. Asian American became a US Census category in the 1980s, or in 1980, including persons who originate from the Far East, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent. The term grew out of a 1960s activism and is sometimes used to show solidarity between cultural groups across Pan-Asian backgrounds. Lastly, AAPI, this common acronym stands for Asian American Pacific Islander and has been used to include Native Hawaiians and people groups from the Melanesian, Micronesian, and Polynesian island regions of the Pacific. Okay. So why people migrate? So that's one of the first things I want to talk about. There are all sorts of misconceptions and false narratives about migration in our society. Most stem from a lack of knowledge about the why behind migration. Some people choose to migrate to enhance career opportunities, for example, while others are forced to migrate due to safety reasons, which often stem from issues out of their control, like war or famine, as I had mentioned. Uprooting your life to resettle in a new country is no small or easy decision, and it can stem from several factors. So we're going to talk about a few of those factors. So the first one is environmental. Migration caused by environmental displacement is usually involuntary. Some examples include crop failure or famine, which can result in food scarcity and the loss of agricultural jobs. This can cause people to migrate in search of food and ultimately survival. Natural disasters also cause people to migrate. For example, tsunamis, earthquakes, and hurricanes have forced people to leave their homes in search of shelter and basic supplies. Another reason is political. People migrate for political reasons, typically tied to danger from war or political persecution. Persecution can arise from civil or political unrest, forcing people to move as refugees in search of safer living conditions for their families. Third is social cultural. Many people migrate for cultural and social reasons birthed from human needs and the desire for a better quality of life, including, for example, relief from discrimination based on nationality, race, religion, or status. Migrants may seek better opportunities for themselves and their families for many reasons, from education to medical needs. Economic. Migration for economic reasons is often what we hear about the most. Sometimes people move to find work or follow a particular career path. However, it's important to note the role played by push and pull factors. So push and pull factors. Oh, let me go back here. Push and pull factors are reasons people would want to leave their home country, or things that push them out. Pull factors are reasons people would want to go to a new country or what's drawing them there. Push and pull factors affect the why in all of the reasons mentioned above. Push factors include persecution, violence, and war. Pull factors include safety, stability, and freedom. Poor wages and lack of jobs push people out, while higher wages and job prospects pull people in. Crop failure, famine, pollution, and natural disasters are considered push factors, while food availability and better living environments are pull factors. Lastly, limited opportunities, lack of necessary services, and family separation push people out of their home countries, while family reunifications, better quality of life, and availability of necessary services pull people into new environments. Push and pull factors work hand in hand, making immigration complex and multifaceted. And I think that this is extremely important to point out, right? The fact that migration is complicated, it is complex. There is no one particular reason or thing to focus on. You know, there are push and there are pull and all sorts of things that, as I mentioned, force people to migrate, or people choose to migrate. We're gonna go over here because I am taking a little bit too much time. And I think we're gonna send you the slides I'm not sure about that, but if we do, I did want to share a little bit about migration's positive impact, which there are so many reasons, and I'll just go through, I guess I'll go back quickly. Remittances, taxes, entrepreneurship, national collaboration, communal gifts. So there are just such wonderful and positive impacts of migration, particularly in the US. When it comes to immigrants in this country. Okay, so I want to talk about scripture and migration because, as I mentioned earlier, it is such a huge part of the Bible. The Bible is all about movement. And as we read through the narratives of scripture, we find that God is not silent on the subject of immigration. Instead, God gives strict instructions on how immigrants should be treated and protected. In many ways, the Bible was written by, for, and about immigrants, migrants, refugees, with countless references to the movement of God's people. For example, in the Old Testament, we learn that God requires through the law that immigrants be treated like those in the native land. Prophets delivered God's messages to the people that they must not mistreat, oppress, or exploit the refugee in their midst. The first reference was in Leviticus 19, and this last one is in Jeremiah 22. The Bible stories are also full of narratives of immigrants or foreigners, including Ruth, Abraham, Hagar, Joseph, and the Canaanite woman who approached Jesus. That last reference, so the Canaanite woman, is in Matthew 15. But something I really love, Chicano studies scholar Robert Chao talks about this, and I really love, he refers to the biblical notion of movement in these terms. He says migration as grace. He explains that God uses the migration process to extend unmerited favor, loving kindness, and compassion both to immigrants and the countries privileged to host them. This speaks not only to the notion of quote unquote welcoming immigrants, but also that doing so leads to a mutuality in blessing, right? I didn't get to go through all of the ways that migration has a positive impact in the US, but it is a mutual blessing. It is not just, oh, we should just welcome immigrants, but immigrants provide so much blessing to not just our country, but our lives in general, right, in the church. Migration as grace speaks to God's law of hospitality with Matthew 25 as its foundation. When we feed, clothe, and look after the immigrant, we do so to Jesus. Similarly, when we reject immigrants, we reject Jesus. Okay, so I also want to talk about now Jesus in migration. I know I just mentioned a little bit of it, but I kind of want to talk a little bit about Jesus as someone who migrated, as well as what other things he has to say about migration. So his own narrative is one intimately acquainted with and affected by the notion of displacement and belonging. In the second chapter of Matthew, we read about Mary, Joseph, and Jesus' flight to Egypt, in which an angel of the Lord appeared and warned Joseph to leave Bethlehem for Egypt because Herod was, planning on seeking out the child to destroy him. And this narrative details the reality that Jesus's family was forced to flee their homeland for fear of persecution, right? That push factor, making Jesus and his family refugees by definition. Not only is Jesus' own life formed by the reality of migration, but he also articulates in Matthew 25 how we are to respond to the stranger, the sick, the imprisoned, and those needing basic necessities. We were to do it as if it were Jesus himself.
Kat finishes off her time talking about the parable, which many of you may have heard about. And so she gave me permission to cut the last couple of minutes here, mostly because, you probably stepped into this webinar and the name of the resource we wrote was How, How to Do This Work. And you might be wondering, oh my goodness, we just sat through a history lesson, a theological lecture, and that's because so much of what we have learned in our work with young people is that we as leaders need to first and foremost do that historical and theological back work, because students are going to show up and all of these realities, they're not going to come and asking, well, some might, I did have this experience, asking really robust theological and historical questions. But they might ask questions like, does God hear my prayer? Does God understand what it's like to live in the world, in my culture, in my skin tone, in my gender, in my race? Can God see what I am bringing? And so when students show up with their very vulnerable questions, there's always a question and a question and a question behind the question. And so this is why it's important as leaders that we don't just respond with our own lived experiences, while that is very important, but that we do the important work to understand, how did we get here? Part of the how to talk to young people is to do the work of how did we get here, and how might I actively participate with young people, or in the worst case of scenarios, which I've had these moments as well, how am I a barrier for young people to have these conversations? Because I myself am so uncomfortable with the conversation in itself that the how becomes overwhelming. And so we're talking about two different hows in our time together. How did we get here? And then how do we then respond? And so for those of you that have been itching for some practical application, I am here to relieve some of that itch for you because the how is important. But as Erin mentioned in the beginning, our own stories, our own first conversations, what was the first conversation you had about race and immigration? What were those like? Because all of those insecurities, all of those unknowns, all of those narratives, that is what we play out with young people in real time, in real places. Young people of color, young immigrants of color who may step into your ministry, or even also white students who maybe have curiosity for this. We have all of this peppered in. We don't always start out with this as a conversation. And so what I want to take us to is to have a conversation about power. Power oftentimes growing up wasn't a word that I heard spoken to very positively. And so I'm grateful for the research that we've been able to do at Fuller Youth Institute and research that we just get to borrow from. And so we have defined power as the abilities to influence others or impose one's own conviction. The truth is that all power is relational. So power structures cannot be held up unless people buy into them. And different relationships either reinforce the current power structure or choose to disrupt it as we lean in differently. A little bit about my story. My family immigrated from Guatemala when I was 9 years old, and they're similar to Erin's story. My parents always championed education. They themselves were degree holders back in our home country, but given all the layers of accreditation and the different ways that education is counted for in the United States, their degrees weren't given the same value as they were given in Latin America. And so over time, when I got my undergrad degree, so did my mom and so did my dad. I went off to get my master's degree and so did my mom and so did my dad and so did my brother. And so we are a family of mucho nerds, which means that we have sat through a lot of commencement ceremonies over the last 10 years. What was so interesting about these commencement ceremonies is that when I immigrated to the United States, I was what's called an ESL student, English as a second language. And so much of what I spent time with was, I was told that I needed to practice my pronunciation. And there were things given to me like Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. And I was invited, and it was my homework to actually practice these tongue twisters as a way to improve my English diction. As I went on to school, to high school, and then undergrad, and then grad school, and now in a PhD program, I was introduced to thought leaders that I needed to know how to say their names. And so it took me so long, because Spanish, the way that I speak Spanish, your tongue does different things. And English is quite a stiff-tongued language. And so I remember practicing saying William Shakespeare for so long, for much of the length of my high school experience. When I got to different layers of education, I remember sitting there going, Soren Kierkegaard. It was such a hard name for me to pronounce, but there was an expectation that I would not only have perfect diction in English, but that I would know how to say these names as they mattered to the academic space. So even though in school, I was so encouraged to have perfect diction in English, and it was seen as a sign of respect and as a sign of knowing how to speak English, there has never been a commencement ceremony in which my name, Jennifer Alejandra Guerra Aldana, has ever been said correctly. Ever. It is now a family joke that after every commencement that we sat in, we always kind of laugh about, like, what version of our name are we going to hear this time? In the United States, there is no official government language. The United States does not have an official language. And yet, the very language of this webinar and the way that the power is displayed in our country is that English has all the power. To speak English gives you accessibility. To speak English in a particular way, in an unaccented way, represents a certain kind of thing. Which reminds us that power is not equally distributed in the United States or globally. While there is no formal annexation that English is the official language of the United States, it has many power structures and people that have supported this ideology to the point that in our own country, there's been laws that have prohibited the use of bilingual education. And there were times in which I was heavily reprimanded for ever speaking Spanish in a classroom, even though the original inhabitants of this land may have spoken Spanish or other indigenous languages. And so what is our response as followers of Jesus? What is our response to this historical society constructed thing that we have inherited? Well, our encouragement to you and our invitation is that we can choose to see where power is held and engage in conversations that begin to redistribute that power. As youth leaders, depending on what your role is in your local organization or church, you may not have all of the power, all of the structural power, but each of us have access to some of it. And so how is it that we can first do the important work of the first how, the awareness of the historical and societally based structures, and be able to say, okay, this is where the power is found. And our response as leaders and people that want to accompany young people is to say, how do I leverage what I have to have these conversations? The most powerful masterclass I received on this was about 2 years ago. There was a young Black man who was killed by the local police department in Pasadena, California. This young man was beloved, a community member. And so many of us pastors wanted to be present and wanted to show up for the community that was grieving a sudden and atrocious death. And so we were invited, and it was told we were going to come and march. And so I showed up with my sign, fully ready to be told what to do, what to say, and how fast to walk. And to my surprise, when I showed up to those steps, what I was invited to was to sit and to listen. And I thought, wait, what's happening here? This is not the idea I have of what it means to march. What the leaders did that day was so profound. And what they did is, instead of leaning into the myth of scarcity that we often lean into as leaders, that says there isn't enough, let me control, let me take, let me hoard, let me make sure that I have everything under control. They chose the reality of the kingdom of God, which is abundance. They didn't take the mic that day. We actually sat through an hour in which they let people from the community, young and old, take the mic and share their stories and share how they were feeling and share about the grief, but also share about the hope, to share in lament and also share about what is it that brought them joy and excitement. And only until we were fully storied, then we prayed with our feet together. Sisters and brothers, we often have the scarcity mentality to take the mic, to control the narrative, to want to have all the perfect answers for young people. And I have felt that myth and that tension so much. And I want to remind you of the truth of abundance that says, share the mic, engage in these conversations. So I want to end my time here and end our time together with leaving you with some of the tips that we uncover in our toolkit. And it's about questions to ask, steps to take, and language to swap. First and foremost, it's so important for every single one of us to ask, how aware are we of our own biases and prejudices that impact how we see the world and the people around us? We all grew up with stories that either gave us a positive or a not so positive view on people that are different than us. I also want you to not go at this alone. So do you have people who will both support you and hold you accountable in this very important work? Vulnerability and teachability are so key in this process. for those of us who may identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. It is important for us to do that awareness work and recognize what tend to be the soft spots, the tender spots. Another language that is often used is trigger. What are those conversations that just bring up all sorts of emotion and physiological responses? How are we tending to our own realities as we step into the for those of you who identify as a white leader, how are you showing up to this webinar tells me so much about your commitment and your willingness and your love to be able to have a training behind it. And so places like these are such important steps in your process. And as a white leader, recognize the how we got here so that we can then know how we engage. There's a lot of vulnerability that is required of us in these conversations. And so make sure that you have other leaders that walk with you and become aware that this is a journey that we each take on, but we are tethered to collectively. Some small steps to take in whatever church community you're finding is to try to increase student awareness in small steps. Like Erin told us, that even though adults in the United States today are majority white, when you look at those under the age of 18, there's a dramatic drop in which 1 out of every 2 students are gonna be either mixed or students of color. But just because students are surrounded by diversity, it doesn't mean they know how to navigate that gift quite yet. And so try incremental spaces of awareness for young people so that they can start to unpack this gift together. We also invite you to invite the young people in your life to give you examples on how they have talked about race, whether it's with their friends, whether it's at school. Simple questions like, what have you heard about this? What have you liked about what you heard? What do you disagree with? Try to do your best to become aware of what are the current conversations that they are having so that you're better able to mirror what you are doing in your time with them in the youth group. We invite you to ask thoughtful questions. For example, what are some things that you hear about the causes of racism and racialized violence? And let them speak those out. What do you know about the history of racialized laws and policies in the United States? How do you talk about this history at school? How have you been presented to it? What is hard about the racial dynamics at your school, in your neighborhood, and or in your very own home? Something we encourage you, if your youth group is particularly ready for this, is to develop your own inclusion ground rules for your groups to be mindful of race and culture, to say, these are all realities that are constructed outside of our control, and yet they are real and they affect us. And so when we step into this place called the youth group, when we are among one another, how might we want to be each other's beloved community? And I'm so thrilled that Montek is going to come and share that with you. But you might want to start the process to develop your own inclusion ground rules, to say the world might say this, but in this room, we will honor each other's unique racial and ethnic background. But in this room, if you speak another language other than English, it will not be policed, it will not be made fun of, it will not be bullied, as some examples. Words matter. As a bilingual person that has spent a lot of her time translating from the very young age of 5 years, not 5, that's an over exaggeration, since the age of 11, words are never just words. Words carry context, words carry tone, words carry stories. Words are never about the actual vowels and letters. That's why our language matters, because what we say communicates what we know and what we feel. So I'm going to give you a couple of liners that we have just seen time and time again. Instead of saying to a Black, Indigenous, or person of color student, hey, tell me what it's like to be blank. In my case, I've heard many times, hey, what's it like being Latina here in this place? We invite you to swap that language, because when you hear that question, it feels like, I call it diversity improv, where you're just kind of going like, I don't know what I'm going to get asked, and I hope I don't have to speak on it because I'm still trying to figure it out. Try language like, or put your own mix. Hey, I'm never going to be able to totally understand what it's like to be you, But I want you to know that I'm going to do the work it takes to be more aware, more educated. But while we're on this journey and where I'm learning and I'm leaning in, is it okay that I ask you questions about anything I misunderstand? I want to make sure that I'm not burdening you with our friendship, but I want to also see if you could be a conversation partner. Ask for that consent before you assume someone is going to be ready to share about their ethnic or racial background. When students face racialized violence, where there is violence, where there is racial conversations, emotions are high. And sometimes we go to very Christianese responses to real human pain. What we have found in our research at Fuller Youth Institute is that those are not the most helpful ways to respond. So we invite you, instead of saying things like, well, God's on the throne and God sees your struggle and God will bring you out of it, or God doesn't give you more than what you can handle. Perhaps we can try something like, I don't have the answers. And I don't know what to say in this moment. But what I do know is that when you hurt, I hurt. And I want to sit with you in God's presence and just cry and be with you. How can I hold this with you instead of trying to make you feel better about something that is incomprehensible? And something I've heard all my life. Hey, your name is just too hard. Can I just give you a nickname? We encourage you to try. Can you help me by saying your name again? I would really like to get it right. It's important that I call you by the name that you are known in your family, in your community, and in your friends. Friends, we hope that this has just been the beginning of a longer conversation. We do have a resource that you can find on our website that explores what we talked about and is filled with even more practical how to talk about race with young people. But above all things, yay, I'm back. Awesome. But above all things, we are so grateful that you showed up to this webinar, and we pray that as young people step into your presence with vulnerable, real questions about, does God see me? Does God love me? Do I belong here? When they step into questions of identity, of belonging, and purpose in your local communities, that you may have all of this as a background to better respond with God's answers to them, which is, you are my beloved daughter and son, in whom I am very well pleased. You are welcome here. And as I welcome you, I won't erase the things that make you so uniquely made in the image of God, but I will learn to honor, respect, and include the very unique things of the way that God has made you. It has been a gift to be with you all, and I look forward to our conversation to come. And so thank you so much for your time. So appreciated. And I'll share some links with you here on our chat for those that want to know more about the resource, more about us, more about Fuller Youth Institute. We are conversation partners with you. We created a resource that we wish we had when we were in youth ministry. And so it's very much a labor of love, and it's very much a first step. And so we look forward to the ways that you will continue to grow as you respond to young people. So thank you so much. I am so encouraged by each and every one of you because this work really, really matters for our young people. So thank you much.
Oh my goodness. Well, Jen and Aaron, thank you both very much for this presentation, and thanks to Kat from afar as well. Folks, please feel free to excuse me, put questions in the chat as they come up for you, and we'll do our best to field as many of those as we get a second to do. I have a question to just start off our Q&A time. For both Jen and Aaron, feel free to take turns responding. Can you name what is the single hardest thing in your experience in speaking about race with young people? And I imagine that answer would really differ depending upon whether someone is white and whether someone is not. Those are really different places to be coming from in this conversation. So would welcome your insight into that and to any possible roadblocks you've encountered for doing this sort of work.
Yeah. some of the hardest conversations I've had is when there isn't a willingness to learn or to see things from a different perspective. I think some of the moments, I coined it as diversity improv because it's a lot of how it felt. It's more difficult. For example, my grandmother actually passed away a couple of months ago. And when it was, yeah, and I don't, sorry, that's kind of like a heavy thing to give an example about, but there is, the death of a loved one is layered, right? It's not just about them passing, it's the memories, it's the story, it's also who's going to plan the funeral and all the family dynamics that come back to us, like,
Yep.
Oh, that aunt that we haven't seen in a long time. And so when it was total, not strangers, but it was people that I have never had a conversation about my life would kind of corner me and go, sorry, your grandma died. Tell me about it. I would go,
Oh.
I don't even know where to begin.
Yeah.
But when it's some of my close friends, or when it's like beloved coworkers who we have been in communication together, and they say, Jen, I'm so sorry. I know what your grandma meant to you. How can I be there? Right. And so similar ways to how we navigate conversations about grief, they're complex and they're never just about someone's passing, but all of the layers, right? It's similar to any conversation about vulnerability, conversation about race and ethnicity. The hardest ones is when there isn't a precursor of a relationship of trust. And when I just kind of get tell me everything about this. And I go, okay, do I start with my story? Do I go with scripture? Do I go with history? Like, what are you wanting me to ask?
Yeah.
And so that kind of improv space is so hard to know what you're asking for. Those have been the hardest ones. And I think in my experience, the majority of those like diversity improv have happened with really well-meaning white leaders who are actively trying to learn, but haven't quite developed any sort of rapport with me or a friendship with me, because these are vulnerable conversations as people of color as well. The ones who have gone incredibly well are the ones when somebody goes, hey, so I read this piece about Guatemalan Americans, and I have seen you do something different. And I'm just curious, could you help me understand how this is different? That's a different kind of question than come tell me everything to, hey, I've taken the first steps on my own. I've done some exploration here and I'm curious, I'm wondering. Those have been the most healing and beautiful friendships where there's always an open door to say, I don't quite get that. Can you help me understand? Because then I've been able to say, I just had an experience with somebody from the dominant culture and it kind of left me feeling a little funky. Can I share this with you? Right. To also have it be mutual, where I have found white leaders to say, I just left a meeting and something felt just different. Could I talk to you about it? And you could give me some insight as to what might be happening here that I just don't understand. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. Erin, I'm curious about what you would have about that.
Yeah, Jen, you really hit the nail on the head with that one, truly, because I think I completely agree with that. I think some of the hardest conversations that I've had is requesting vulnerability from me, but not having that same vulnerability on the other side of the question. And I think there's so many assumptions and projections and prejudices that are entered into in these conversations. And I think there sometimes can be there's a defense that comes up already talking about these conversations, where I've received those as well. Instead of asking me a question, kind of talking at me and then saying, well, what do you think about that? And I'm like, well, that's not a conversation then, right? Like, let's both come to the table with that vulnerability and teachability to learn from each other, So I think that's been some of the most difficult. And I mean, Jen explained it so well. I think I would really agree with that.
Yeah, what comes to mind is in listening to both of you is that, improv has nothing to do with relationship, right? There's a tokenizing and a sort of putting a spotlight on an individual for improv, right? I mean, my brain even goes to the image of a stage and you're improving and you've got the spotlight. It's like
Right.
you, and you are in the center of it. Relationship is a back and forth. It's a conversation. It involves mutual vulnerability. And as someone who is white, being able to say, I don't understand this. Would you be willing to talk with me about this in a way, that's an honest reflection that leads to more honesty and vulnerability, but it's a two-way street there, and it's a conversation, and it usually comes from deep relationship that has already been built up, instead of like, tell me about you, tell me about all of your things, which is just a really different approach. So thank you for naming that. And I would reckon with young people even more so, right? Because young people and youth are really in a tender time of identity formation. For both white youth and non-white youth to be able to do this from a place of authenticity where there's good communication back and forth, modeling that as an adult would really matter. So yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. We're getting some really good questions from the chat, so I want to get to some of those. Folks, if we don't get to your question, I am very blessed to be able to say I'll get a chance to talk with both Jen and Aaron in a subsequent interview setting. So if we don't get to your question, I will later, and we'll be happy to get clips of that will be sent out to you subsequently. So if we don't get to it today, don't fear, don't fret about that. We'll get there. Imran asks, societal inequity results in people being treated differently, like the health outcomes, which have been exacerbated by the pandemic. What considerations would you have when approaching people who also suffer from trauma, something which is often unrecognized and causes so much harm? So yeah, what is the interplay here with trauma in these kinds of conversations?
This is such a great question. Thank you for asking it. One of my dear passions, and something that I talk about a lot, especially in my circles with my friends of color, is, and I'm pretty sure I talk about it in the race guide as well, about generational trauma. There's a current trauma that exists within our society, and especially in marginalized communities with what's happened with this pandemic. But I think what a lot of people don't recognize is that, especially in our bodies as people of color, there's so much generational trauma that already exists within our family lines. And so with a lot of the research we've done at Fuller Youth Institute and with interviews that we've done with young people, is seeing that so many of our young people of color are sick and have mental health issues and all types of things that they don't fully understand. But it's such a dynamic with our youth. And it is so important to have the conversations about the trauma that exists within our communities, and that is exacerbated, yes, by this pandemic. And I think mental health services and encouraging that is so important. And I think it's something the church still really needs to catch up to, and encouraging that, and really having it be a way to experience God in new ways, through mental health services and through having those deep, raw, honest conversations about the experiences we have in our everyday lives and in our bodies. And I don't think that they should just be addressed nonchalantly, like they really need to be addressed with serious care. So as important as I feel it is, like, talk about it within your youth groups, like if they're open and really comfortable enough to share that. But I think also encouraging mental health and services and therapy, and really trying to resource your students in your communities to say, hey, I can't talk with you about this maybe on a professional, psychological level, but it's important for you to heal. It's important for our healing. And something that I've done, is I am a big proponent of therapy. It is so important. And I always say I'm doing the healing that my ancestors weren't able to do. I have the luxury of healing like they didn't. And that is multiplied tenfold. Like the healing I'm doing is going to really create that ripple effect to future generations. So I think it's really important to approach that in those ways.
Yeah, I thank you, Mar, for that question. You know, racial trauma is real trauma, and it lives in our bodies. And so, some of the things that I did with my youth group when we would engage in these conversations is that there was always an invitation for them to do something with their bodies as we were having this conversation. So much of what happens when conversations about race enter the room is that our body starts to activate. So for me, as my palms get sweaty and my lower back starts to hurt, I know, oh, oh. And so one of the important realities of our Christian tradition is that we have a plethora and such a wide amount of contemplative practices. And this is when we pull from that deep well to say, you know, God is a God who's not just interested in meeting us in our thoughts, but God is a God who created us as a whole body who happens to also have a head. But how do we involve our whole bodies in this conversation? So there's been times when conversations have been really heated and we have two students going at it, and I said, wow, this is so rich. And I want to invite you to shake your arms out. And I want you to take 3 deep breaths with me. Let's breathe together. And once we have breath and say it, and we're going to take a moment of silence. And it's not a way to shut down the conversation, but we had reached a moment where this was starting to be really painful for students. Yeah. And we needed a moment to say, okay, can we become aware of God's presence again? Not so that it shuts the conversation down, but so that we remember what the goal of the conversation is. We're not here to debate things, and we're not here to convince each other. We're here to have a conversation in which there is a back and forth that is predicated on the reality and the belief that we are both made in the image and likeness of God. And therefore, let me take a breath. So things like breathing, things like holding silence with students. There's a lot of times where I had them walk in and say, hey, we're going to talk about racial dynamics in the New Testament today. The story today is going to get real. I never surprise students with this conversation, just like I would not want to be surprised with this conversation. And so I warned students and their parents to say, we are going to unpack this together. I want you to know. So a lot of it comes from my social work training. This should never be a surprise. You should tell people what you're wanting to talk about. You should prepare them so that they know what they're walking into. There should be a consent to say, as anything we do here, your participation is totally voluntary. If this is not something you can or want to engage with, here are 2 alternatives of what you can do for youth group tonight. I always had an alternative. Most people didn't do it, but I just wanted them to know, if this is something you can't sip into, you are not going to be excluded. Here are 2 options of what you can do while the rest of us kind of like wrestle this out. The third was to include moments of pause and reflection, because this can often come like, it's just so visceral sometimes. And the fourth is that I always began with my story. Something as leaders we have to do is to model the level of vulnerability we want our students to go to. And so if I want them to go to a level 3, I better set the conversation at a level 3. I better not do my shallow sharing and then ask students to like give me all this meat when I've not done it. So when it comes to vulnerability, you set the stage and you hold the dynamics. And after every session where we talked about race in youth group, there was always a space of pay attention to your body. Where did this show up? Did the back of your head feel a little tingly? Did your arms get sweaty? As you go on from this place, I was like, this is why the Christian tradition believes in Sabbath, because these conversations are work. And so after we work, there is a commandment to rest. And so I would invite every student and say, what is one thing you're going to do that is kind and nourishing to your body today? To say, wow, body, thank you. You leaned in with so much courage today. Let me nourish you right back. So announcements, consents, alternatives, conversations that bring us back to our bodies, and a reminder that because this is work, we also need to find pockets where we rest and we are nourished back to have the conversation again. Because if we're just going back to back to back to back, well, there's a point where we're just going to be like, I hate everyone and I hate everything. And so we don't want to get there. And so we want to encourage our students to practice these ancient Christian tradition things like eating together, breathing together, resting together, because this conversation shouldn't be emptied from those. It should be surrounded and dipped by all of this.
Yeah, that's good.
That's really beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question from Kaylee, who asks about thoughts or resources on unlearning oppressive or anti-Semitic language in New Testament stories or teachings. And equally, how do we learn to add pro-Middle East and African language and images into our understanding of the scriptures? And I would add to that our teachings of them and sharing of them with young people. Yeah.
Yes. Kaylee, that's a really important question. And I would say that there's an article that comes to mind, and I saw your question, so I Googled it really fast. It's something that our own team at Fuller Youth Institute has been sitting with as we also navigate conversations in which, anti-Semitism should be part of anti-racist work, and it's important. And so I will type it up here, but there's an article called Putting Anti-Semitism on the Anti-Racist Agenda in Northern American Schools for Social Work. So this is from the social work field, but I think we can learn so much. And so there are scholars out there that are actively thinking about how do we include conversations of anti-Semitism when we talk about race. So I will type that in. And this one is by Nora Gold, is the author of this article. So I'm glad that you're thinking about it. I am no expert in it, so I'm happy to just share the resources that I have been sitting with for the last 8 months, and hope that that kind of brings you to your own process of learning. And one of the realities when it comes to understanding of scripture is that I'm teaching, and it's a bilingual classroom, which is its own experiment, trying to rip away at those power dynamics, right, of English dominant ways of learning. And I always remind my students, I actually have it right here. I carry a bilingual Bible, mostly because I learned to read scripture in Spanish. And so the Psalms just don't taste right when I read them in English. I'm like, I have to hear Psalm 23 in Spanish. It just does something differently to my body. But so much of how we engage scriptures is from a monolingual space. But the scriptures were inherently a bilingual, intercultural project from the beginning, where, Old Testament mostly written in Hebrew and New Testament mostly written in Greek, and through a process of a lot of people, we got it in English. And so I carry mine bilingually. So first, I think is to, there's a beautiful amount of commentaries of thought leaders that I am thrilled that in the last 10 years, I've seen an enormous amount of growth in voices to hear from. And so one of the things that I would encourage you is that you look for understandings of scripture that come from Middle Eastern or African theologians and thought leaders. I also have found that the way that pop culture describes God or religion is also a very interesting inroad. So, for example, taking a look at the way that different kind of cultures have come to understand God and the images they use for Jesus. Growing up in Guatemala, the image of Jesus I had is a particular kind of Christ that is in the Caribbean, which is the Black Christ, El Cristo Negro. And it wasn't until I came to the United States and immigrated that I ever saw Jesus with blonde highlights, like really beautiful textured hair and like white skin, right? And so even things like that, right? How do we even talk about the different ways in which different people groups have represented Jesus? And there's so much art, there's so much iconography, there's so much pop culture of how different spaces. And so for one youth group night, what I did is I put all sorts of different renditions, and I said, okay, let's read some of the gospel passages, and how do you see these different images of Christ actually be reflected in what we're reading? And students were like, oh, I never thought, oh, and there was all these aha moments, right? And so art is a really powerful way to introduce these conversations. Learning from theologians, there are many, and I'm happy to send some names over so that you can particularly look at them, Kaylee, and I'll type in the name of this article that I have been so grateful to learn from. So, yeah.
Yeah, that was beautifully said, Jen, and I completely agree with all of that. I was actually going to share in the chat as well some blogs that we and other leaders of color at Fuller Youth Institute have written this year about Black theologians that are really important for young people to learn about, Native, Indigenous theologians, Latina theologians for our communities to learn from, and API theologians as well, that are important for us to learn about ourselves and also to give more language to our young people about, a God that meets them where they are and knows their experience and experience their experiences, so just like Jen said, I didn't always see Jesus as Black. Like I grew up in going to a Christian school and I also just saw white blonde haired Jesus. And it really took a long time for me to, it actually took me like going to seminary and really like, bringing God to where I am and be like, oh, this is a new God for me to truly experience in my experience and in my body. And I still have to work sometimes on, that iconography and the way that I see God, because I have so much of that internalized oppression and all those other things that I grew up with as a young person. So I think bringing these different theologians and thought leaders to the conversation that truly relate to our youth and their experiences is also so important in changing our language, changing the way we see God, all of those things. So I'm putting those in the chat as well.
Yeah.
The chat is such a wealth of resources, both from you both, and also I'm seeing from some of our presenters, which is such a gift. And another example of, when we come together, we really bring so many resources.
Yeah, I was so glad to see the work of Laura James be highlighted. And I think you all, I'm so grateful. Martha, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, please take a look at the way that she describes the divine. And the practice of Visio Divina would be so powerful with students or adults, to take a look at it. And I would just say before we go, just like in 30 seconds, which I know is hard, I just wanted to validate, where is that question? I saw it. Wendy, your question as a white person having trouble simply engaging white youth in racial differences in history. Our team just published a book called 3 Big Questions. And one of the things that we uniquely did for that research project was that we oversampled for students of color. And so we had 25 students that we spent a lot of time talking about identity, belonging, and purpose. And as part of our research methodology, we did ask a couple of questions about how they related to their racial backgrounds. And our team, as we sat there with all of the interviews and all of the people across all research, every white student we interacted with had a total paralysis when it came to talking about race. Some of them were like, well, I see the news. Well, I see this. And I just wanted to reiterate that to you, is that what you're feeling is what we're seeing nationally. And part of that, when we undig that, is that part of this, one of the downfalls of this melting pot, kind of idea that many of us grew up with, is that the uniqueness of those that were immigrating from Irish and from Poland and from France were totally erased. And then there was this creation of the white culture. And oftentimes when I hear from my white friends is that they were explicitly told, you don't really have a culture, you go and learn about culture from other people that are different than you. And so one of the things I would encourage you is that there is a process called desegregation. And that is a process in which you take these that's a whole nother workshop to talk about how we got to what's called pan-ethnic narratives, which is to say, everywhere else in the world, y'all, I'm just a Guatemalan, I'm a Guatemalan native who lives in the United States. It is only within the bounds of the United States that I am Latina. It is only within the bounds of the United States that there is this notion of African American, Asian American. Everywhere else in the world, those categories do not exist. Therefore, it is important for students, and particularly those who come from white background, for them to not see themselves as blank canvases, because that is simply not true. Some of them have Dutch heritage. Some of them have French heritage. And it is only when we are able to see our own uniqueness, then we can welcome others' uniqueness. We cannot receive into a vessel we have not identified, right? And so nationally, we're seeing this deficit in our white students because they come from generations that were actually totally socialized and systematically told, you don't have a culture. We forget about our early languages. And so when they encounter other migrant groups or other people of color who have such a rich canvas, where the question is, what part of the canvas do you want to see? There's this deep insecurity to say, I don't have a culture. And so with my white students, I said, oh no, you absolutely do. Tell me what you do for Christmas. What are your mom's favorite meals? What do you eat? How do you celebrate? That's culture. It's something unique that a people group does. And so it is uniquely challenging right now for our white students nationally to step into these conversations, because they come as a byproduct of generations who were told, you're going to blend in and just be called white moving forward. And so for the same way that I want our people of color and our students of color to be seen as unique in their background and their culture and their ethnicity, I also wish that for my white students, that they get to see where they come from and to see we actually have migration stories in common. Like, do you remember why your ancestors came from Ireland? I actually can really relate to what your family went through. It's just that was your great grandfather. And for me, that's me. There's a generational difference, right? And so just to echo what you're feeling is real, it is national, and it requires for us to help our current parents and white students to say, we're not a blank canvas. We just have to actually bring those stories forward to create more connection within students. So.
Well, I'm going to jump. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to echo what Jen said, and also the listening part about youth in that conversation and talking to their families, talking to their grandparents, talking to their parents, having those conversations about their family history is so important too, because they may not ask, and they're like, we're white, we don't have a culture, we don't have whatever, and that's not true, like Jen said. So encouraging listening and talking and having those conversations with their own families is super important. Yeah. Sorry to cut you off, Kelly.
No problem. I'm glad to let you finish. I'm just going to jump in here because Jill has had a little coughing jag and is losing her voice. So I just want to thank you both so much for being with us and for helping us to take this next step in this conversation. Really critical work for us to be doing ourselves and to be doing with our youth. And so thank you. And hopefully this is just the beginning of many more. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being with us. And we hope to see you next month.